Welcome to the Supplement Engineer Podcast. My name is Robert Chinetsky. Today we're joined by Dr. Abbie Smith-Ryan, PhD in Exercise Physiology. Dr. Abbie is an accomplished researcher, a certified strength and conditioning specialist, and the Director of Applied Physiology Labs at UNC. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Abbie. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start with a little bit of your background. What led you into the research path? Have you always had a passion for training, nutrition, and supplementation? How did you get to where you are, and what jumped out to you during your progression in your career?
It's a good question. I haven't thought about that in a long time. I was a former athlete in college and really got fascinated by the human body then, and started some research as a freshman in undergrad, really looking at silly things. I was analyzing wrestlers' pee in the lab in the middle of summer. And then as a former athlete with injuries, I had 9 stress fractures as a collegiate distance runner, really coming down to overtraining and poor recovery. And so I had this big interest in answering important questions that could contribute to not just athlete health, but overall health.
Mm-hmm. With that, when you're at the collegiate level, what kind of role do supplements play at all? Because I know y'all have a team nutritionist or a team dietitian that y'all work with. You have trainers, you have coaches. Where do supplements intersect in that exchange? Are y'all allowed to kind of pick and choose what you want to, or does the university just say, hey, you are only allowed to take X, Y, and Z, creatine, protein powder, or caffeine, that's it?
Yeah, so I ran at a Division II school, so we actually didn't have a nutritionist. So we were on our own to do nutrition or what the coaches gave us, which is not, it depends on their background.
Yeah.
And as a former athlete, I actually didn't believe in supplements. I've since changed my tune. I wish I knew then what I knew now. But here at UNC as a D1 school, even the bylaws have changed where the university can provide some supplements, particularly things like whey protein, carbohydrates. Mm-hmm. And then most, not all, but a lot of sports dietitians will say no supplements at all. And then some will say, if it's third-party tested, particularly NSF, but you have to take them on your own. And then sometimes it's a matter of like, here's a list of companies that we recommend.
Yeah. Since your lab is doing some of the cutting edge research, and you have access to some of the top athletes in Division I, especially the men's and women's basketball teams and the baseball teams too, that have been prolific for decades. Do you ever get to work with them and say, hey, we're kind of working on this. Do y'all want to try this out here? Or do you ever do they consult you at all to say what's on the cutting edge to help our guys get an extra edge?
Yeah. So we don't, it's really hard to do an intervention with a, NCAA Division I college athletes. We'll do a lot more measurement with them, like body composition measurement, and help them interpret maybe some of the stuff that they're doing. Mm-hmm. And then I'll work with the sports dietitians on, some rehab cases or some of the cutting edge science. They're not, there's only 2 of them for as many athletes as we have. So they have less freedom to really kind of, look at the literature and apply it, but mm-hmm. sometimes we will, or I'll, I teach a lot of athletes that are exercise and sports science majors. So we cover a lot of that, and I'll work with them kind of on a one-on-one basis.
Excellent. With your lab that you're running, how does it go about deciding what you want to study? Is it just a topic that you get a specific grant from a company to conduct the research? Do you kind of have your own topics that you want to? And obviously you've got grad students working underneath you that are working their way towards their dissertations and theses. And so they have to come up with a topic that addresses a very specific research question. But what kind of input do you have, and do you conduct any research just out of your own personal interest?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the beauty of running my own lab. I can do whatever I want to do. So it's a little mix of both. So a lot of times, all my federally funded grants are projects that I created and wanted to pursue. Mm-hmm. My industry-sponsored trials are not. Sometimes I'll study an ingredient that maybe I'm not super interested in, but all of the studies that I've done that are funded by sport nutrition industry, they've come to me and said, we have this product, but then I've still designed the study to measure what they'd like. If it's going to work, mm-hmm. we can maximize those outcomes.
Right.
And then I usually design it that if it doesn't work, or we still have some interesting takeaways, and we'll still publish that data. So mm-hmm. that I like to think I still have my personal flair on. And then even with my students, generally I won't bring in a student if they have contrasting, not interest. It has to be somewhat aligned in my wheelhouse so I can be an effective mentor. And then I work with them to kind of hone their special interest.
Gotcha.
So then we work together to kind of make sure their study aligns with an important research question, but also something that they're interested in.
Okay, excellent. With the industry-funded research, so often from the consumer side of the people, that 5 to 10% of consumers that actually understand how supplements kind of work and what the ingredients do, very oftentimes they'll say, well, this study was funded by XYZ company, so that invalidates the results. And, we're at a crossroads because NIH and the FDA and all these people aren't going to just give us millions and millions of dollars to conduct these studies on the next wave of supplement ingredients. So as somebody that's actually received some industry funding and conducts your own research, how do you address those kind of complaints from people?
Yeah, I actually think it's pretty funny because it's usually those comments are coming from people that have never done research, and research in humans is very expensive. Well, research in animals is also very expensive. And so the interesting thing is, so it takes money, and NIH actually is not super interested in funding exercise and nutrition research. I've even had calls with them. They think obesity is far beyond that. Like, we have to go way back. And so I think the sport nutrition and nutrition industry has a little bit more flexibility, and meaning there's a little bit more freedom to be creative and push the envelope a little bit and be more high risk, which is, I think, where the changes happen, where we start to see some cutting edge research. And as far as conflicts of interest, I think it's, I wish I could show the world how many headaches I deal with to do an industry sponsored trial, and how many things are in place to prevent conflicts. And so in any field, we have our own bias and we have conflicts. And so, I mean, that's regardless of if you're getting money or not.
Right.
But within a university kind of sponsored trial, there are a lot of things in place to make sure that the company never sees the data before it's unblinded or has even any control over the outcomes. And so to me, that's partly why I've kept my hand in the industry, is to continue to produce and publish high quality, kind of scientifically rigored based sport nutrition data, because it's not always that way.
Right. Yeah, obviously. There's quite a few notable examples of certain ingredient studies that are, we'll say they have a complicated and checkered past. We'll leave it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing too is, as a scientist, it's sometimes hard to change your hypotheses, right? If you go in thinking or even showing that something works, and then you do a study and it doesn't work, you have to, it's not a hit to my ego, but you have to be able to adapt, and especially new technology. And then I've always made it my case, and I tell companies up front that I'm going to publish it, whether it's positive or negative. But you also have to realize, a company that's willing to put money towards their product is obviously one, they feel like it's valuable and they're investing in it.
Right.
And so even kind of describing what that means and kind of clinically meaningful, and some companies are even interested in changing their formula based on the data. And so I think all of that is really important, that usually there's good intentions going in, and then what happens after is not always the case.
Gotcha. How much input do the actual nutraceutical providers or supplement companies have into the design of the study, how it's written up at the end, the exercise protocols, all of those things? How hands-on are companies, or is it more on a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, case by case. From my experience, usually the companies that I deal with, they want more help with the study design. I've had a couple cases where the company said, okay, here's the package, here's exactly the protocol, but there's still we'll go through and all this is not necessarily what you want to do, or have you thought about this, and they'll adapt a little bit, and then it's less stringent, or I would say more stringent if it's a multi-site. So if two sites are doing the same study, then there's usually less flexibility. But I would say in our industry, not so much like direct pharmaceuticals, more on this ingredient side. There's a lot of investigator influence. So we spend a lot of time working on protocols.
Okay. And to where, say, if they came for you, you can kind of help them figure out which protocols or which tests are more apropos to test whether an ingredient is going to be beneficial or not. So they may come in and say, hey, we want you to run X, Y, and Z tests, but you say those might not actually be as appropriate to test for this compound as maybe A, B, and C tests would be. Something along those lines?
Absolutely. And I think that's why, I mean, I would hope some companies like pick certain labs because we have the experience with certain ingredients or protocols to know, particularly with exercise, it's really hard to overpower exercise. Exercise is great. So then you don't want to make the protocol too intense, but you have to have a stimulus. So there's a lot that goes into outcomes, even which outcomes the most sensitive, so that you can identify a change. And sometimes that's lab specific as well.
Gotcha. Do you get to lobby for which ingredients or supplements that you would want to test? So say that there's some new kid on the block, and there's been 1 or 2 trials on it, but you really like it and you think you'd want to see what you can do with it in your lab. Can you make a proposal to these supplement companies and say, hey, we want to test your ingredient in our own tests and see what it'll do?
Sometimes, so we've done that in cases. So generally in that case, not always, but a lot of times then I'm doing the study for free or out of my own kind of pocket. And so sometimes we'll wrap that up into a student project, or we'll apply to some like student grants or smaller grants where I can fund part of it that way. And then there's sometimes some companies will have like an application process that you can reach out to them, or even I'll reach out to the company directly. Oftentimes they won't fund the project, but they may maybe give me the product for free.
Okay.
So then it's like one less cost by the time we pay for everything else.
Gotcha. What is it that makes research so expensive? I'm sure there's a multitude of factors, but can you, I guess, hit some of the highlights of it?
Yeah, so one is personnel. So if we're doing any sort of exercise or nutrition intervention, it takes a lot of people to be able to meet with the subjects, making sure there's no adverse events, and if it's training, so time, manpower. And then any sort of biological sample that we get, so blood, saliva, urine, muscle, that it all takes money to pull it and then to analyze. There's a big cost.
Okay.
Oftentimes there's a cost to pay the subjects. And then there's a cost usually to publish the results. Not always, but there's a cost too. So depending on the protocol, if I have the equipment already, I can try and make it cheaper. But then a lot of times those cheaper studies aren't really giving you sophisticated outcomes or more global outcomes. Okay.
I had Dr. Trexler, who I believe he's part of your lab a couple of years ago, on the podcast recently. And one of the discussions we had was trying to make science more accessible to the everyday individual, because so much of research is published, yet very little of it is actually read by most people. So, him and I were talking about, and I'd like to get your thoughts on, what can y'all do as researchers? What can the journals do to help get science out there and more effectively communicate and get it in the hands of people so they can kind of do their own due diligence and read it for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, this is $1 million question, and Trexler's a great person. He worked for me for 6 years, and he saw kind of the pitfalls of academia and went to a space where he could translate some of that research, which is great. I think a lot of it is like, to me, one of my favorite things to do is to give talks and to translate some of that. But there's only so many hours in the day. And so I think now there's been some interesting strategies where you have a few people that are specialized in infographics that take the time, even their full-time job, to translate some of that. Yeah. I think social media is kind of a good thing in the way that you can accessibly give science, but honestly, most of the scientists, if I'm not working on a grant or collecting data or writing the data, like I don't have a lot of time to actually translate it. Right. Even though it's super important to me. So but I think the social media makes it a little bit more accessible. And so even in my part, some of it is training younger people that have a passion for that can do it effectively and evidence-based.
Yeah, I find social media to be a dual-edged sword, especially with science communication, because you want to drive home the salient points of a study, but then you also run the risk of oversimplification and people taking it the complete wrong way. So there's got to be a really good balance. And there are certain people that are putting out really quality infographics and information that are giving really good synopsis of the way studies are and what the take-home points are. It's just that I feel is the hard thing for the consumer or just the average person looking to try to understand what in the world's going on is how do you separate the BS from the truth of everything and figure it out. So that's, I guess, an ongoing challenge, but that's been going on for decades. So I don't know if there is a solution to it or not.
No, but I mean, even like a part of all will try and always accept to do podcasts and other kind of more translational things because that's, I don't want to say an easy way, but I can tell you the information and you get it to the people that matter. And so those things, a lot of scientists don't want any part of that. And to me, it's an important piece of what we do. Yeah.
What goes on in the day-to-day lives of a researcher that's actively, delving into the latest science of human performance, supplementation, and nutrition?
Oh gosh. Every day is different, which is good, I guess. And it's a lot of, lots of data collection. So lots of human interaction, which is great. A lot of grant writing and grant rejections, a lot of data compiling, analyses, a lot of writing. I also teach, so you have to juggle that. And then a big thing that I love about my job is mentoring. So working with the students to kind of help them understand their data and translate that piece.
Gotcha.
Those are kind of like the day-to-day things.
Yeah. Does it help to have that you kind of have your hand in so many pots to avoid fatigue in one area? So you get to spend a little time grant writing, a little time researching, a little bit data collecting, teaching, mentoring. Do you enjoy having a multifaceted job, or would you rather be able to just kind of zone in and just devote all of your resources to research or just all to teaching?
I think some of it is good. I think it's probably how I'm wired. I have too many things. Some people may say I have ADD, I can't focus, but like on top of the teaching, then I'm on committees and service. And so it's hard. The longer I'm in the field, the less I have time to do what I really love to do. Like I love being in the lab with the subjects and talking to them how they feel. And that helps me create a better project. Instead of, I'm working on budgets and like all the stuff that I should have been an accountant. I hate numbers. I don't even balance my own checkbook. And so I think some of it is good, but it's also trying to, stay within your passion, yet you're pulled lots of different ways.
Gotcha. For the average person that is trying to read research on their own, what are some points that they can use to help identify quality research from suspect research? We'll phrase it that way.
That's a really good question. Well, I guess one kind of key thing is to see what's the culmination of the literature. So if there's several studies saying the same thing, that's like a good way to see what's happening. Yeah. Also looking at one thing that it's hard to describe, but every measure that we have has a different sensitivity. And you can show a lot of things by looking at different statistical methods. So looking at what I call variability of measurement is important. For example, I may show that someone is increasing strength by, 3 kilograms, and it's statistically significant. But 3 kilogram strength is really not that much. And so you can never undervalue the human interpretation. And I think that's where even a lot of non-scientists can read a paper and say, what's this really telling me? What's the clinical application? Not clinical. What's the meaningful application of these strength changes, performance changes, body comp changes? And not get so wrapped up in the statistics per se.
Yeah, that's one thing, especially when new ingredients hit the market. You'll see outlandish numbers like 348% increase in nitric oxide or 258% increase in lean body mass or something. But when you drill into it, you can always make something statistically significant, how you manipulate the data and calculate the stats and whatnot. But how do you drive home a meaningful significance, and what cases of that have you seen in your own lab, maybe, of something being statistically significant, but in the grand scheme of things, it's really not that big of an impact?
Yeah, actually, I think my lab's notorious for the opposite. We often don't see a lot of statistical significance,
Hmm.
but when you look at the values, there's meaningful change,
Hmm.
and that's a lot of how you run the stats. But a big thing that is even gaining more traction is really it's basically looking at individual responses. It's like individual heterogeneity of the outcomes,
Hmm.
and so you can get a good feel, like, is it one person driving the change? Is there responders and non-responders? And so it really goes back, in science it's hard because you may present it a certain way and then the reviewers will say you need to do it a different way, or this is, and so I think it really leads to interpretation of
Hmm.
those outcomes. And so if you can compare what I always try to do is compare those outcomes to something that someone would understand.
Hmm.
So if someone's, running a 40 time, it's 5 seconds faster, that's clinically meaningful,
Correct.
but it may not be statistically meaningful. And a lot
Hmm.
of that has to do with the variability of your sample. If
Hmm.
people have lots of different responses, and so as an author, it's important for me also to do some of that interpretation.
Hmm.
And some people don't really care about that, or they maybe don't understand,
Hmm.
or sometimes it's influenced by, we want to show a significant effect. Sometimes
Yeah.
people feel like they have to.
Gotcha. Oh, I guess if they don't, then I guess that would run the risk of maybe them not receiving as much funding, or that same company, whoever provided the initial materials or down payment, may not return. So I can understand that temptation, or that just even not a temptation, but that little voice in the back of your head saying, "Well, we've got to put this in some kind of positive light so that it looks like something is worthwhile in this whole thing." Is Very often with exercise studies and supplement studies, the populations of the individuals that are being studied are relatively small, somewhere between like 10 to 40, 50 subjects. Do you find it hard to get a considerable sample size for your studies? Because I've heard it is complicated or difficult in other scenarios, but just in your own personal experience, is it difficult to get a quality study population?
In my experience, no, but it also depends on what population you're trying to target and
Hmm.
how strict you make the inclusion exclusion criteria.
Yeah.
And as an investigator, you kind of bridge the gap of, you want the sample to be similar, so homogeneous, but you don't want to make it so strict that you can't apply it to anybody in real life.
Hmm.
And so, our young, healthy, trained, that's really easy. Those are good quality subjects. It makes it harder if we're trying to get some of our more middle-aged, healthy but not on a lot of pharmaceuticals.
Hmm.
And we start taking out some of those real life things, it makes it a little bit more difficult.
Yeah.
But it just takes a little bit more time.
Gotcha. Is it relatively easy to pull students from the population there at UNC?
Yeah, we do some student-based studies, but our most recent younger studies, actually the big handful, are all that are pretty trained
Hmm.
and more resistance trained. And I find it funny. So I did my PhD at University of Oklahoma,
Hmm.
and there were way more meatheads there, whereas here they're more like aerobically trained.
Interesting.
So I don't. It's not like we can just walk out and pluck people from
Yeah.
anywhere. We do have to put in some effort, but that's why you provide some incentives. And we always try even providing incentives on their results, describing their results, how they can use them. So
Hmm.
it's kind of like even like a one-on-one consult to get them to buy into.
Gotcha. Recently, you were part of a team that published a narrative review on supplement and nutritional interventions to improve high-intensity interval training. Can you do a brief recap for the listeners that may not have read through that paper yet, and to
Oh,
what some of the
I don't.
findings were?
Yes. Now you're speaking my language. So that came because there's not very many trials that have looked at both, and
Hmm.
that's both like kind of the marriage of two of my research lines: nutrition and interval training. And I mean, collectively, we looked at a couple of different ingredients, and it's the same ingredients that we see that work. So, creatine, maybe some citrulline, you're getting
Hmm.
your caffeine, We're finishing up a lot of work with like essential amino acids,
Mm-hmm.
and how that can enhance interval training,
Mm-hmm.
and even looking at the timing of things. And so there's a lot of data that suggests that the synergy of nutrition and HIIT can even be more effective.
Mm-hmm.
And what I like to even think about is how can it be applied to even people that maybe can't do as much training volume. So some of the clinical
Mm-hmm.
groups, or cancer, or some, where they're not young and fit and healthy, and it doesn't really matter what they eat.
Do you think beta alanine is beneficial for the average gym goer that goes and just does a few sets? And I know the majority of the data is either for long duration stuff or high repeated bout effort. So several sprints in a row with short rest periods. Do you think? But we see it in just damn near every pre-workout supplement. We see beta alanine in there. Do you see much benefit at all for that population that just goes to the gym a couple of times a week and hits a few sets?
Yeah, so I should preface this in that I did my thesis and dissertation on beta alanine. So,
Right.
Interesting. I don't know if we've like tapped into all the mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one, I'll preface it and say it, and it shouldn't be in every pre-workout, because you need a bigger dose that can be in a single serving. So if I just take it once, it's not doing anything.
Correct.
It may make you tingle once, but it's not really going to do what it's supposed to do. I do think it has benefit for the everyday gym goer if to help the exercise feel better and recover faster.
Mm-hmm.
Or like, I don't even know how to describe it. It won't necessarily make you feel like Superman or Superwoman, but you may feel better after, or not as fatigued.
Mm-hmm.
So that's some of the antioxidant and even the heart rate mechanisms, brain mechanisms that we haven't totally teased out.
Yeah.
But it's also one of those things that you could load for 4 weeks and then not have to take it for another 14. So I don't think it's one of those things that you need to take all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like me personally, I remember I started taking it after I had babies, or had a child, when
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to kind of like regain my fitness, and I was sleep deprived. So I was able to like feel a little better, but it's not something that I take all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe if someone has an increased training volume or having a hard time recovering, that might be something to think about.
Yeah. And I guess the rate of decay I'm not sure what the appropriate term is, but the rate of decay. So say you reach that 179 gram saturation point of beta alanine in the muscles. Will it maintain that for, you said 14 weeks or so? So it might not be exactly that, but you've got several weeks, and I would assume something like creatine and betaine would be synonymous to that, where it'll maintain that saturation for maybe a month or two, and then it'll start to dip off. Yeah,
so beta alanine has a longer half-life in the muscle than most others. Mm-hmm. So creatine's is a shorter, like if you were to load, it would definitely dissipate faster. But the nice thing about beta alanine, you do have to load for it for 3 to 4 weeks. Mm-hmm. But then you don't have to worry about supplementing. Some of the data says 14 weeks. Some of our half-lives are shorter, so 7 weeks, but still something that you don't have to take it all the time. And you're not going to get that through a pre-workout.
Right.
So it would really take kind of that daily multiple supplementation. Or if I'm doing a pre-workout, some are dosed where I just have to take it every day repeatedly for several weeks.
Mm-hmm. You also did some of the earliest research on Pico-2, and that's been kind of floated out in the supplement space as some companies are positing it as a direct competitor to beta alanine. Some of them are saying it can be synergistic since they work via different pathways in the body. Since you've studied both of these pretty extensively, how do you see them? Do you see them as complementary? Do you see them, what one is better for like a resistance training population, one is more for like an athletic population? How do you view them?
Well, they work in different mechanisms. So beta alanine works as a hydrogen ion acceptor, so it helps maintain pH, and so that works in different types of environments and could help with recovery. Whereas Pico-2, it seems to be really, the key ingredient is cordyceps, so the mushroom, where it's doing potentially something with oxygen consumption, and so that would probably be more effective for aerobic exercise, which is what we showed. And that's another interesting one where it wasn't all statistically significant, but when you looked at the data, there was some clinically meaningful changes in VO2 for no training.
Right.
And so I mean, that's not going to necessarily be huge for a lot of people, but it may help aerobic exercise feel better or
Hmm.
may help them adapt a little bit quicker, which then may help with some training volume.
Yeah,
So different mechanisms.
gotcha. Um, a few minutes ago, you mentioned that you were doing some research into essential amino acid supplements. Are those studies that are currently going on, or ones that you had recently wrapped up, and you can give us some insight into what you're doing with those? Because that's for the past year or two. It's, we had BCAAs as the go-to amino supplement for almost a decade, and then EAAs started to gain popularity, and now there's kind of a war where some people say all amino acid supplements are useless. Then you've got the people that are diehard BCAAs, and then the people that are still trying to, plant their flag or saying EAAs are the way to go. So, what has been your experience with them, and what do you have kind of working behind the scenes right now as far as those supplements?
Yeah, so one study we're just analyzing now and we'll present this summer in a couple different ways.
Hmm.
But right, collectively, the literature is showing is that BCAAs aren't really helpful for muscle protein synthesis. They are helpful for oxidation during aerobic exercise,
Hmm.
and we really need all the essential amino acids for building muscle, recovery, etc. And so we are looking at the patented EAAs, so
Hmm.
the real patented version, in synergist with high intensity interval training.
Hmm.
And showing some interesting results. Really, I think one of the benefits of the EAAs is that, like, we'll do some work with bariatric patients and some clinical groups that maybe can't use lactose or like a whey protein.
Hmm.
At the end of the day, a whey protein isolate has all of our essential amino acids.
Right.
But there's some issues with that, like the taste and a number of things.
Hmm.
Whereas the EAAs are more of a Gatorade flavor, and so you could potentially do that between meals or for older adults or for some different groups,
Hmm.
or maybe people that don't want a huge shake, they can have like more of a fluid. So
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of potential, and there's even um, some new data that was just published a couple weeks ago that shows an even greater response if you take the EAAs and add leucine.
Hmm. Is that the one that was
That
just published in the ISSN journal?
I can't
Is
remember
that the
what
one?
journal is out of Arnie Ferrando's lab.
Okay.
And so he is one of the founders of the patent of the real, but
Right.
interesting. So like when we think about leucine, it's important, but they showed some interesting results as if you add the EAAs plus the leucine, it may be even better.
Hmm.
So for most of us normal meatheads, that like lifting heavier weights will matter. But if
Right.
you start to apply that to some groups that maybe can't provide that stimulus, it becomes to be pretty interesting.
Hmm. Is there any work underway that you know of to identify an optimal EAA ratio for these supplements? Because they're all over the range. Most of them have 5 grams of the 211 BCAA, so 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine, and then we've got 1.25 grams each of isoleucine and valine. And then the rest of the EAAs is 300 milligrams of this, 50 milligrams of this, 100, and so forth. Is there any way to identify an ideal human ratio of EAAs or anything like that?
That's a good question. I don't know. I have to ask some of my colleagues. I think the biggest thing is that there's enough leucine and that there's enough of all the EAAs.
Hmm.
And then I think just depending on the protein source, it changes some of the amino acids. But generally, if it's a complete protein, then you're going to have enough of the essentials.
Okay, yeah, and it's not going to be one of them, something like methionine. It's not going to be the rate limiting amino acid in the MPS reaction.
Right. And if you have even like a casein or an egg protein, like most of those are going
Hmm.
to have enough of the amino acid, the essential amino
Yeah.
acids.
How do y'all decide what, I guess, bolus dose of EAAs to use? Because in line with the different amount of EAAs in there, we'll see something anywhere between 5 grams of an EAA blend to something like 10 or 12 grams of EAAs. So how do y'all go about choosing or selecting what amount to use?
That's a good question. So I think some of it depends on translatability. Nobody's going to go buy 12 grams of essentials and have it
Right.
in between meals. So personally, when I choose a study, I try and look at practical application.
Hmm.
So I may show that 12 grams is amazing, but what application does that have? So
Yeah.
closer to like a real dose. And if I'm doing like a whey protein, then obviously the whey protein is going to be slightly higher in essential amino acids. So
Yeah.
that translates in there.
Gotcha. What does your own personal supplement regimen look like?
People always ask me this. Depends on the day,
Mm-hmm.
but regularly, let's see, what do I take? I take high doses of fish oil. I do take a probiotic, even though it may not work. In my head, it works. And I do take a multivitamin. I think that was left over from kids. It's more of a plant-based.
Mm-hmm.
I do use whey protein, daily dose of creatine. Right now, beta alanine, but that is not all the time.
Okay.
Let's see, what else do I take? Sometimes I'll do a pre-workout, but I do pretty low caffeine.
Mm-hmm.
Those I think are the major ones.
Are you a big coffee drinker by and large? Is that why you use a low caffeine pre-workout, or you just you don't need a lot of caffeine just by nature?
I over caffeinated for years, and so I'll drink decaf coffee with maybe a touch of caffeine. I'm just high on life. I don't need all the extra caffeine. So just low caffeine's amazing. I just try and keep it limited.
Gotcha.
Some nootropics. There's some great nootropics out there that I've been experimenting with.
Can you name any specific ingredients that you might be? Because that's my passion project or my pet project are nootropics. So if
you probably could educate me. Like the mucina or mucine purins is kind of an interesting one. And then I don't know, the ashwagandha.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple. There's some interesting data on the teacrine, which is not necessarily a nootropic, but
right.
Yeah, to me, that's a fascinating area. Particularly, they give you this alertness and help with mood, yet not a crash, which we can all use that.
Yeah, exactly.
The caffeine that kind of tinkers with some things.
Yeah,
do you have a favorite?
Oh man, it kind of depends on the day and what mood I'm going into. So if it's in a workout setting, I like a certain set of nootropics in that. So things like tyrosine or mucuna, which kind of work on the dopamine system, I really like for that. If it's more just like a work session, I'm just going to be sitting down, reading through studies or writing a paper for 6 hours. It's going to be some kind of mix of cholinergics in there. So it's either the two big ones are alpha GPC or CDP choline. And the more that I experiment with both of those, I just gravitate more towards CDP choline because I find that, and especially a lot of the prepackaged nootropics these days, they put in higher and higher doses of alpha GPC in there. And when you combine that with huperzine, it just ends up making me feel tired and just kind of unmotivated to do anything. But if I do CDP choline, since it's got a lower choline content by mass, that in tandem with the huperzine or just a high dose of CDP choline by itself, I get this really cool like neural charging effect where your brain feels switched on, almost like caffeine, but without as intense of an energy rush. So it's like this optimized, heightened alertness without feeling super, like you want to just run through a wall or something.
Absolutely. And I think that I feel like the part of why those are gaining traction is based on our lifestyle. Like I have 80 tabs open and then I think about something else I need to be doing. And so some of those nootropics help me like, okay, accomplish this. And then I'll go to that, which is obviously helpful for productivity.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And another one that I'm really fond of, you mentioned teacrine. I use that every day, whether it's included in my pre-workout or I just take it with a cup of coffee in the morning or something. But rhodiola is a great one just for an afternoon work session. If I've already had my pre-workout for the day and I don't really want or need any more caffeine, because I'll just have caffeine one time a day usually, and I don't really need it after that. But rhodiola in the afternoons is great for like an afternoon work session where it'll keep you energized, but I don't find it disrupts my sleep or anything at all like that.
Absolutely. And this is not a shameless plug, but I've been I consult for Ladder and work with Adam Bornstein, and I don't make any money off of it, but they it's been really fun to actually create products with effective ingredients in actual doses. And so we've put rhodiola and the huperzine A and in a lot of the products. And so I think it's fun to see some of those come to fruition, where a lot of companies will maybe sprinkle it in or use, lower percentages. And so, it's kind of, bridging this marriage of science and application.
Yeah, I very, very much like nootropics. And it's back when several years ago when DMAA was still around and a bunch of the other exotic aggressive stimulants, when those started to get finally blacklisted and banned, I thought, I said at the time, nootropics are going to make their way into this space, and it's cool to kind of see that. I kind of guessed right that it was slowly happening, and so I really like it. I just wish more companies would dose them properly or dose them accordingly.
Yeah, well, and it comes down to some of them are expensive. Like rhodiola, you could use something cheaper, but it's not going to have the same effect. Correct. And most companies want the bottom line, which is important, but can you kind of do both? Right.
And rhodiola and a lot of the other adaptogens too, like ashwagandha, taste horrible. I mean, they're utterly abysmal. They're as bad as bulk teacrine is when it comes to taste. Those are some of the foulest tasting compounds I've ever had.
Well, so is cordyceps. I'm surprised you didn't bring that up.
Yeah.
So
well, I've actually taken a spoonful of the Pico 2 powder by itself, and when you just eat it dry, it reminds me of like wet bread dough or something, like uncooked cake batter or something like that. Yeah, is what it reminds me of.
Well, it could be worse, right?
Yeah. I find rhodiola worse, and I'm somebody that likes bitter food, so that's a rough one, but it is what it is.
That's why there's food scientists, right?
Exactly. The flavor chemists these days are phenomenal, what they can do with protein and intra workouts and everything like that.
Absolutely.
Since you brought up the topic of probiotics earlier, you recently were involved in the position paper that the ISSN put out. Walk through, and they've put out several of these. They've done one on caffeine, they've done one on creatine, they've done one on protein. How does it go when you have this, Avengers-esque assembly of people that are contributing to a paper? How do you get involved with it, and what role do you actually do in the writing and drafting and reviewing of the paper?
Yeah, it depends on the paper. Like for example, Trexler and I co-wrote the beta-alanine position paper. And so generally you have a couple key experts that take the lead and kind of take the lead on pulling together the data and the outline and the form. And then if somebody some people that have an expertise in the area, they will invite, and also I've also found like if you provide a lot of constructive feedback, like if somebody sends me a paper, I'll shred it apart and provide a lot of feedback.
Yeah.
And so that also allows for authorship on the position papers. So really, are we collecting all the data? Are we capturing it? Are we missing anything? Are we adding sections? Are we, are there other aspects that we're missing, or are things misrepresented?
What were, for the listeners out there, can you briefly sum up what y'all found as far as probiotics? Because that and keto supplements and a lot of other MCT oils and all of these are very big buzzwords in the industry right now. So what were your preliminary findings on the paper?
Yeah, the probiotic one is kind of interesting, I think, because in my opinion, the probiotic field is still relatively young. And so generally the position papers come out when there's enough data to garner some sort of position. Which is one thing I think the ISSN does really well, is like, here's our take, and it may change, but it is somewhat practical. So probiotics in general, well, one, the absorption is enhanced if taken with a prebiotic. So delivery mechanism can matter. It's strain specific. So there's certain strains that you'd want to take if you're trying to target irritable bowel syndrome, or if you're trying to target exercise performance or amino acid absorption. There's some interesting data coming out there. And then, probiotics need to be taken daily. You can't just take it once and it's going to change your gut. And so consistency matters, and that, like, the type matters. Also, even where you buy it and source it and how it passes your gut. So the quality of the probiotics matter. Yeah.
And how it's stored too, whether it needs to be refrigerated or, most of the ones on the store shelves that are just sitting out in regular bottles, are those going to even be active, or would they need to be refrigerated?
Some of them, I think some of it will be active, but it'll be less active and they probably won't last as long. Okay. I usually will buy mine online. I'm hopeful that it gets to me quicker than sitting on a shelf, and then store it in the refrigerator. Yeah. And then there's some that are in the refrigerator already. Yeah, those are going to be better. Okay. And you mentioned that prebiotics, I guess, may enhance the uptake or, potentiate the bioavailability of it. Would taking it with a meal that's rich in fiber, since that acts as a prebiotic of sorts for the gut bacteria, enhance the uptake of them, do you think? I don't know. That's a good question because most probiotics you're supposed to take on an empty stomach,
Right.
just because it influences other things. So maybe if you took it with like a Metamucil or like a like an inulin type of thing, it might
Hmm.
enhance it. But yeah, I would say probably not with a meal.
Gotcha. You mentioned that you had a child earlier on the on our chat. Would you feel comfortable giving them supplements? Have you already given them supplements? Because we have a 2-year-old, and I've given her just whey protein powder if I'll mix it in yogurt or something like that, or make a smoothie or something. So I'm curious. Anybody that I interview that has kids, I'm curious what their thoughts are on supplements and the safety of using them with their own kids.
Oh yes. So I actually well, one during pregnancy had a pretty rigid supplement path with high doses of fish oil, creatine, kind of whey protein to kind of enhance fetal development.
Yeah.
And then during nursing, all of those things. And then right now, so I actually started doing probiotics when they were really young. There's some interesting data on specific strains for prevention of like colic and gas.
Interesting.
I have two little boys, so boys are more likely to have gas.
Mm-hmm.
Also found that it really helps with the immune system. So we still give a pretty like a probiotic daily mixed in yogurt.
Mm-hmm.
And then they often steal my protein shakes, and we'll do like Fairlife has many kids protein shakes, so they'll do that like as a snack. So I don't necessarily feed them a whey protein shake, but they'll do half a scoop of whey with like a smoothie.
Mm-hmm.
And then I usually put creatine in like my drinks, and they'll drink some of that, but I wouldn't. At this age, they're 4 and 2. I'm not going to give them creatine.
They don't need to be juicing on creatine just yet.
Yeah. And then I haven't yet increased. I try and give them foods fortified with DHA and omega-3, but I don't directly supplement with them, but am conscious of giving them higher values of that through specific fortified foods.
Yeah. Any specific foods you'd recommend? Because I've got a liquid fish oil supplement that I give our daughter. And her vitamins have her multivitamin has some extra added into it. But do you have any other functional foods that you'd recommend?
Yeah, like the omega-3 eggs, and we use the Fairlife DHA added milk. So some of the milk stuff that they're drinking, anyways. And then we give them a multivitamin too, just to kind of catch all.
Right. Yeah. Same thing we do. Just insurance.
Yeah.
For that. You've done a lot of exercise research, supplement research, and nutrition stuff. Is there one area that you're more pulled towards than the others?
Oh.
Or is it just kind of rotating, after you do so many, you're kind of burnt out on that one, you just want to jump to one of the other topics and investigate that?
I like to think that I always have a fire in each of those categories. The fourth is body composition measurement. And so it's generally not necessarily one area. It's what's one study showing that I might add to the next, and then synergistically can kind of combine them. I think right now a lot of my research is focusing on or kind of taking a turn of, we have a lot of great data of how supplements work and exercise works, how they work together, but then more importantly, how it maybe works differently in women. So a lot of our data, particularly our supplement data, has been in all men.
Right.
And so we have different physiological needs. Do they differ? And if not, then great.
Yeah.
And so even tackling that and what happens with age and menopause and how we can kind of prevent some of the negative aspects through time.
Is that when trying to assess how it affects females, is it a matter of replicating a design protocol that was done in a previous trial using caffeine, creatine, whatever have you, and a certain nutritional program that they were using, or are you designing something completely new and that's more gender specific?
It depends. Like we've done tackled some of the nutrient timing stuff in just women, particularly based on data that like trying to tackle the myth of fasted cardio and fat oxidation. So looking specifically at women because we know a lot about how it responds in men.
Yeah.
And then like our interval training and essential amino acid study, we get both men and women and see if they respond differently to say, do we need to make different exercise and or nutrition prescriptions to have a similar outcome? Yeah. So a little bit of both. And
based off, I guess, preliminary evidence, have you found very significant changes between the two sexes when it comes to either nutrient timing or the EAA supplementation with interval training?
I don't know if I want to say significant,
Yeah.
but I think some
Noteworthy.
clinically
Yeah.
meaningful.
Hmm.
Yeah, particularly, I think we are doing our field a disservice of having the same exercise and nutrition recommendations for men and women.
Hmm.
Like, for example, we have a paper that, gosh, maybe it came out in 2019 looking at nutrient timing in resistance trained females.
Hmm.
And it looks like pre-exercise timing may be more important than post.
Okay.
And to me, that's valuable. Particularly, most women won't eat before they exercise, and
Right.
so even taking in some of those intangibles of preconceived notions or just lifestyle differences to really target and give specific recommendations for the population.
Gotcha. What have you experienced in your career as some of the biggest hurdles to getting research completed and published?
No, um, not enough time in the day. I think the peer-reviewed process is always quite frustrating.
Hmm.
So I find that my most innovative projects and
Hmm.
like new statistical techniques, reviewers have a hard time understanding, so they just reject it or they don't like it. And so
Gotcha.
some of those, like I have had a paper in review for, I think I submitted it before my first child was born. It's still in review like 4 years later.
Wow.
And so then it's just sad that you have this cutting edge research that by the time you publish it, either someone else has done it
Yeah.
or, it's not that novel. And so that's
Yeah.
a little bit tricky because then you have to kind of tailor. I'll just go back to traditional stats and it may not show, what
Yeah.
you want or like as novel findings.
Right. And that was one thing I was speaking with Eric about was, why is that? Because the two papers that y'all recently published on citrulline malate versus beetroot supplementation was done back in 2017, and it wasn't published till 2019. I was asking him, and you can expound on this as well. Why does it seem that, and I guess part of the peer review process is part of the reason to blame, but are there other factors why it sometimes takes so long for supplement research to get published from when it's actually completed and reviewed?
Well, just in general, a study takes a long time. So by the time I develop the study, submit the IRB, do the study, like right there, that takes at least a year usually.
Okay.
And then once if you are at a time where we have the time to go ahead and write it up right away
Hmm.
and then submit it, some journals are quick and they'll return it around pretty quickly.
Hmm.
I've had journals take up to a year to even review the paper. And then it'll come back with revisions or rejection, and then you're kind of back at square one.
Hmm.
And it's also kind of Russian roulette about what journal may accept it.
Or can you submit to a wide variety of journals, or is it you have to pick one and then you have to wait for an answer and then resubmit to somebody else?
Yeah, you can only submit at one time, and then you have to wait for an answer. And then there was a tweet one time that talked about how many hours it takes even just to reformat a paper and submit it and revise it.
Hmm.
Like sometimes I'll get a paper back with revisions, and I don't have time to work on it for 3 weeks to sit down and like basically address every person's comments.
Yeah.
And then you submit it, and then they can still reject it, and
Hmm.
then you can submit to another journal.
Do y'all know who the peer reviewers are when the papers get submitted to them, to where if you see somebody that is on the review board for your paper, you see them, and it's like that bad professor you had in college that you knew they just had it out for you, and other ones that hey, we've got a good relationship, even though they may grade me hard, there's nothing personal, but is there ever any of that kind of stuff that goes on with papers and review boards?
Yeah, so you can always see the editorial review board, but
Hmm.
some journals are open where you can see your reviewer and they can see you as the author,
Hmm.
whereas others are blinded where you can't see the author or the reviewer.
Hmm.
But you can usually see who's on the editorial board, but that they can send it to anybody. So
Okay.
the thing about it too is part of why I like to train young or new scientists. They don't necessarily have to be young, but the peer reviewed process should be really helpful, and
Hmm.
it's not. Like when I review a paper, I spend a lot of time to give positive feedback, even if there's a major flaw, so that
Right.
they can learn from the process.
Hmm.
Whereas a lot of times we'll get stuff back, and people are like, "Well, you didn't cite my paper, or you didn't say it the right way, or I'm going to give you a litany of things that don't really matter or don't change the results." And so
Yeah.
trying to look at the positive sides of the peer review process can make all of us better scientists.
Gotcha. What is to come from your lab in 2020? Because we're still in the very first months of 2020. So what's ahead for you for this year in your lab?
Some exciting things, I think. We've had some heavy data collection months here. So um, some HIT and EAA sex-based differences, that'll be coming out. We'll present that this summer at NSCA and ISSN, and then the paper will be submitted this summer too. Spent a lot of work on looking at differences in race and ethnicity and body composition measurements.
Mm-hmm.
So all of our baseline stuff was made in white men, kind of our formula. So
Mm-hmm.
exploring that in different races. Some interesting data on how you might adjust metabolic rate based on obesity, and kind of considerations there for weight loss and application.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, I've had a couple papers in review for years, HIT and osteoarthritis, looking at some metabolomics. A lot of the metabolomics hasn't been published, which is really novel.
Mm-hmm.
We have this really great nutrition and rehab paper in review, really an application of how you might apply sport nutrition to a rehab scenario, looking at supplements and kind of nutrient timing.
Mm-hmm.
That, to me, is something that is practical.
Outstanding.
Those
Great.
are a couple little
sprinkles
of
no, that's outstanding. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Abbie. This was a very enjoyable conversation. This is the part of the show where you can shamelessly plug anything and everything you want to and where people can find you.
All right. Well, thank you for the time to chat and talk about nerdy science things.
Yeah.
I'll just say, if you're in the local area, we have lots of studies, and I have a website. It's asmithryan.com. I'm giving lots of presentations this summer. Always fun to see people. And then I always just thank my lab team and students. And I have 2 PhDs that will be graduating, Katie Hirsch and Malia Blue. And then obviously Trexler's leaving his mark. So that's fun. Always fun to see.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you again for your time, Dr. Abbie, and have a great week.
Thanks so much.